This is Macquarie Island, an uninhabited spot discovered in 1810. A 49-square-mile patch of land with conditions so harsh, it wasn't even used as a penal settlement. Though they had plans for it, the only ones who showed any real interest were the seal hunters, since there were plenty of seals around. And even though hunting there was tough and no one liked coming to the island, the money you could make was a pretty good incentive. What normally happened when Europeans turned up where animals had no natural predators ended up happening here too. By 1919, seals were almost extinct, and penguins were close to disappearing along with them. The birds were being heavily hunted as well, but the hunters didn't come to the island alone. Their ships had some stowaways like rats and mice who also really liked the island. There were birds here and no predators to stop the rodents. All this led to people bringing cats to the island and later rabbits too. But they only made things worse. As always, I'll sip some coffee and we'll keep going. Just an unobtrusive reminder to hit the like button if you tend to forget about it at the end. I'll probably start with something really simple and maybe even obvious to some. When any ecosystem has been evolving for many years without outside interference and without predators, animals don't have any defense against them. There were predators on the island, of course, but all the local creatures knew exactly how to deal with them. For example, petrels spend most of their time flying over the open ocean, only coming to land at night to nest in underground burrows so that birds of prey can't get to their eggs. It's a good, solid strategy. But it turned out to be completely useless against rats, and rats were brought by people pretty much everywhere they sailed. As a result, petrels, like other seabirds, ended up among the most vulnerable groups of birds in the world. On Macquarie Island, just like everywhere else, rats hunted chicks, gobbled up seabird eggs, and even killed adult birds. Trying to survive somehow, the blue petrels had no choice but to breed only on the rocky cliffs along the shore. Rats eat pretty much anything they can find. They're amazingly efficient and will go after all sorts of animals, pretty quickly wrecking the ecosystem. But it's not just animals that suffer. Rats also munch on flowers, seeds, fruits, and newly sprouted plants, seriously cutting down the number of seedlings. And maybe people in the 19th century wouldn't have paid much attention to this small stuff if rats hadn't started bothering them personally. People would come to the island to hunt and stayed there for a while, which meant they brought supplies along, and the mice and rats were more than happy about it. Why bother looking for food outside when you could just sneak into a house and eat in comfort? Even though the island was considered uninhabited, there were still some buildings there, like the station of the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, set up on the isthmus in the northern part of the island. It's been operating since 1948, but that's not really the point. What matters is that the rodents went after the hunters' supplies, and they had to take action. And who else could deal with mice and rats if not cats? People actually brought them to the island hoping they'd protect food supplies from all kinds of pests. Though there's another theory saying nobody brought the cats on purpose. They sneaked onto ships by themselves and ended up on the island just like the rats, purely by accident. But the important thing is that the cats arrived. And it happened sometime around the early 19th century, though I couldn't pin down the exact year. But I found out that rabbits appeared on the island about 60 years later as part of the tradition of leaving animals on islands. It was done so that hypothetical sailors who'd shipwrecked near Macquarie Island would have access to food. So the rabbits showed up on the island in 1878, and then, as often happens when a bunch of rabbits are released into the wild with no predators, they started multiplying like rabbits. And behaving like rabbits too. For example, they ate the vegetation that was hiding and protecting the albatross nests, making the birds vulnerable to attacks by skuas, local predators. And rabbits eat just as they breed, meaning very actively and without even trying to hold back. When they move into coastal areas, the green slopes often turn into barren land. Instead of the usual vegetation, there's this weed called poa annua, and the bare patches turn into what looks like neatly mowed golf courses, cut by rabbits. So overall, not so bad. But you can't hide in that kind of landscape anymore. Rabbits eating local plants also led to soil erosion and landslides, destroying seabird nests. It's the rabbits that are responsible for the island's severe erosion. They not only eat the leaves of plants, but also destroy flowers, seedlings, and the root system, which ultimately leads to the complete death of the plants. And by scratching and burrowing into the plants, rabbits often break the surface bond of the vegetation cover. This causes water, wind, and temperature erosion. As a result, in September 2006, there was a big landslide in the Lusitania Bay on the eastern side of the island. This landslide, covering about 5,400 square feet, partially destroyed an important penguin colony. But what about the cats? Of course, they were hunting rats, but then people brought in rabbits. Much easier prey, and the cats pounced on the poor things with double the force. With such a great diet, the number of cats started to grow rapidly, but the rabbits didn't fall behind. By 1968, when the authorities introduced a deadly myxoma virus in an attempt to wipe out the rabbit population had exceeded 100,000 individuals. Apparently, even active predation wasn't enough to cope with the rabbits' reproduction rates. By the way, the virus strategy worked. By the 1980s, the rabbit population had dropped to less than 20,000 individuals, but we'll get back to that later. For now, the key point is that cats, which relied on rabbits as a food source, started eating seabirds instead. They didn't face much resistance from their feathered victims, and as a result, they racked up a devastating 60,000 seabird deaths per year. In the end, all these animal introductions caused huge damage to the local wildlife, including the extinction of the Gallerallus macquariensis, the Cyanoramphus erythrotus, and another yet-to-be-described species. In total, over 10 species of seabirds quickly declined and were wiped out. It's time to do something about that. By the 1950s, scientists started to worry that the island would be changed forever if no one took action. They tried different ways to save it with varying results. For example, starting in 1985, efforts were made to get rid of the cats. This was done through culling, meaning shooting them. By June 2000, the last of nearly 2,500 cats had been killed, all for the sake of saving the seabirds. But with a decrease in the number of predatory cats, the rabbit population suddenly grew again. By that time, the rabbits had eaten about 40% of the island's vegetation, causing an ecological crisis worse than the cat problem. This is what the area looked like after they fenced it off from the rabbits. You can clearly see how the vegetation on the island was supposed to look and how it actually looked. The rabbits ate everything. At their peak, there were about 300,000 of them, plus an uncountable number of black rats and house mice, because there were no cats to keep them in check. To assess the consequences of the initiative to kill the cats, a group of ecologists compared satellite images of the island taken in 2000, when the last remaining cats were killed, with a set taken in 2007. In these pictures, you can clearly see the difference between healthy and dead plants. The living vegetation looks bright red. Later satellite images show how much the landscape has changed. A rapidly growing rabbit population has destroyed the lush grassy areas on the coastal slopes, eating them clean. And what grew instead of the native plants? Well, as I said, it wasn't suitable for seabird nesting, and the situation looks hopeless. Invasive species turned out to be so interconnected with each other that any changes in their numbers led to serious, even devastating consequences. Even scientists say that the sequence of events in Macquarie is a rare example of a trophic cascade, a chain reaction of changes in the population of one species. The next step could have been the collapse of the ecosystem, so there was only one option left: to completely clear the island of invasive animals. The island was declared a wildlife sanctuary under the Tasmanian Animals and Birds Protection Act back in 1933. By that time, seals and penguins had almost been wiped out. Then in 1972, it became a state reserve, and in 1997, it was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List for its unique geological features. On June 4, 2007, a press release announced that the governments of Australia and Tasmania had reached an agreement to jointly fund the eradication of pest rodents, including rabbits. They approved a plan estimated to cost over $15 million. According to estimates, in 2009, there were 130,000 rabbits, 36,000 rats, and 103,000 wild mice on Macquarie Island. So there was plenty to work with. The eradication program was a multi-pronged attack, including shooting, bait dropping both by hand and from the air, the use of hunting dogs, and the introduction of calicivirus. Active efforts started in mid-2007 and took about 2.5 years. The first, or even the zero stage of biological control, was aimed at reducing the rabbit population as much as possible before the bait dropping program began. To do this, people spread grated carrots laced with the virus in selected areas with high population density and also trapped rabbits at night. But then it was time for the bait. This is how the bait was loaded into the container, which the helicopter would take and drop all over the island. And this is what the bait looked like: green pellets meant for rabbits and rodents. The whole program included 2 helicopter drops of bait across the entire island, and a third, much smaller drop was directed at areas considered especially dangerous, like cliffs and penguin colonies. In the first days, 300 tons of grain bait were scattered across the island, which led to the death of many rabbits and rats. The bait was spread over 2 winters to minimize the risk of killing non-target seabirds, and then it was time for the calicivirus, the virus that causes hemorrhagic disease in rabbits. Right after the poisoning, a dozen tracking dogs and a team of hunters were dispatched. It was actually expected that this ground-based extermination would take about 3 years, but it only took 7 months in 2012. This was because the calicivirus significantly reduced the rabbit population. Over the 7 months, the project team has been manually collecting and disposing of poisoned carcasses to reduce the risk of secondary poisoning in seabirds. They also continued shooting, disinfecting burrows, setting traps, and of course they called in the dogs for help. Dogs played a really important role in these campaigns. Back in December 2002, 2 dogs and a few guides helped wipe out all the cats on the island. Similarly, after the aerial culling program in 2011, 12 dogs, including Springer Spaniels, Labradors, and 1 Terrier Cross, covered more than 56,000 miles searching for any signs of surviving rabbits, and these weren't the most pleasant tens of thousands of miles. Sub-Antarctic Macquarie Island is a harsh environment for both humans and their 4-legged friends. Before the campaign began, the dogs underwent thorough training to make sure they weren't distracted by local animals like penguins or seals. The breeds were chosen carefully too. They handled the cold, wet climate well and proved to be great at the job. In 2013, 3 more rodent detection dogs and their 2 handlers joined the search, and in 2014, the eradication program was declared a success. In honor of the dogs that worked on the island, postal stamps were even released, so the campaign was successful. In February 2012, the Australian newspaper reported that rabbits, rats, and mice had been almost completely wiped out on the island. Then, in April of the same year, hunting teams reported killing 13 rabbits that had survived the 2011 poisoning. Since April 8, 2014, Macquarie Island was officially declared pest-free after 7 years of conservation efforts. This achievement became the largest successful pest eradication program on the island at that time, and since then, the island has remained clean. In May 2024, it was reported that there have been no pests on Macquarie for 10 years, and the vegetation's been thriving. It's still considered the largest and most remote place where the complete eradication of 3 invasive species has been successfully completed, but this status requires constant and thorough checks for biological safety. For instance, dogs still work for the island, and everything that comes to the island is checked by them, because there's always a risk that a mouse or even a rat could sneak into baggage or cargo unnoticed, and we all know how that ends. Well, you get the idea. The dogs check all incoming ships as well as buildings on the island to make sure no mouse or rat has slipped through this very tight biosecurity net. However, they're not just looking for rodents. A lot of efforts made to check for any potential weeds, and backpacks, shoes, even jacket pockets are vacuumed and cleaned before they're allowed onto the ship. By the way, after 2014, it was time to clean up the island, and the extra huts that hunters and dogs used during the invasive species eradication program are being torn down. After all, why keep them in a place that's supposed to remain uninhabited? Moreover, without invasive species, the island clearly feels better. This became noticeable almost immediately after the program was completed. Populations of many bird species started to recover. For example, the Pterodroma lawsonii, which was close to extinction in 2000, has shown significant growth, and its population is now slowly increasing. 2 other species, the Proceleria cinerea and the Halobina caerulea, which had disappeared from the main island since the 1900s, have now returned, and their populations are also growing, about 10% per year. There's one thing to clarify here. Even though Macquarie Island was declared pest-free, a few invasive bird species still live there, like the mallard and the common starling, but luckily they don't cause too much trouble for the locals. Or not really. Scientists have even estimated that today, there are more native animals on Macquarie Island than ever in the last 150 years. And this, in turn, is good for the plants. The logic is simple. When birds return to breed, they also leave droppings. This adds nutrients to the soil, which in turn helps the plants get stronger again. The tall plants then help the birds hide from predatory skuas. But even though the vegetation and wildlife respond quickly to past destruction, the island as a whole will need much more time to recover. It'll probably take somewhere between 30 and 50 years for the island to regain the level of ecological stability it had before humans showed up. Well, humanity should probably learn a lesson from everything that's happened and treat such ecosystems more responsibly, because well-meaning attempts by nature conservation experts to fix the island only made things worse for a long time. That's definitely not the way to go. You owe me a like. See you later.